So let's look at...
Well, good morning everyone, and welcome to this meeting of the Poverty Committee. I'm Duran Watterson, MHK, Chair of the Committee, and with me are Mr Rob Callister, Ms Joni Farragher and Mrs Sarah Maltby. Today we're meeting with Dr Kelvin Corlett from Statistics Isle of Man, and can I begin by thanking you for making the time to come and speak to us about the calculations of the living wage and related matters, including how a poverty measure could be calculated for the Isle of Man. For the benefit of Hansard, can I ask you please to introduce yourself, including your title and how long you have been in that role, please?
Certainly. I'm Dr Kelvin Corlett. I am currently Head of Statistics for Statistics Isle of Man, which I have been in the role since late 2021.
Thank you. And you over to Mr Callister.
And thank you, Chair. Good morning, Dr Corlett. I was wondering if we could start to ask you to explain what the living wage figure is and how this figure is calculated.
Absolutely. So the living wage was introduced on the Isle of Man in 2017 due to a political will at the time that we have something comparable to what in the United Kingdom is known as the real living wage. We calculate this according to the same methodology as is employed in the United Kingdom, with some modifications to make things more applicable to the situation on the Isle of Man. So if it wouldn't take up too much time, I'll explain roughly how it's done in the UK and then discuss our amendments to that process. So the United Kingdom, its real living wage, it is produced outside of government by third sector organisation, the Living Wage Foundation, and it is based upon minimum income standards, these being for different family types, different family compositions. Each one is assigned a basket of goods and services that are deemed to represent the very minimum that someone needs to live what is agreed to be a decent or good standard of living. The way this is identified is primarily through consultation, focus group work, qualitative research with households of each demographic and each of differing economic status. So you may have 9 households of single males, and they're consulted, come to an agreement of a basket of goods that represents what they in their mind believes represents the least that's needed to have a decent standard of living. Once complete, these baskets are audited and edited slightly by experts, just to maintain, just to ensure that everyone is living a decent standard of life in the context of nutritional requirements, adequate heating, so forth. So you might see one basket, if it's missing a certain amount of nutritional value, that will then be put in by expert opinion. That work is all carried out by Loughborough University, who've been doing this for a good while. These are then calculated, a living wage is then calculated for each such household based on their minimum needs, which is finally combined into an overall living wage, which is a weighted average of each of these sub-living wages. They will be weighted according to the proportions that each of these types of household make up of the population as a whole. We, on the Isle of Man, operate broadly according to the same procedure. In fact, due to just the necessities of resources and time, we take the United Kingdom's publicly available baskets and goods for each household type. That is our starting point. We then amend them to ensure that what we are left with is as appropriate to the Isle of Man as possible. So, for example, if certain shops are used in the UK that we do not have available here, we will find the very closest possible in terms of quality, in terms of style of offering, that is available on the Isle of Man. We also adjust slightly on the issue of private rents. In the UK, until recently, the living wage was calculated on an assumption that private rents would be, well, the value they used was, I believe, the lower quartile of rents in the east of England. They've recently updated this to the lower quartile of rents for the entire United Kingdom, excluding London. On the island, we adopt a slightly different approach, because if we were to look at a lower quartile measure, due to the relative lack of one-bedroom privately available rents at any one given point in time on the Isle of Man, in that case we would be left with maybe 2 or 3 properties. And of course, a living wage is supposed to be operating on the assumption that households have access to this type of property. So if we were to use that, it would be a little bit artificial. So instead we use an average of the rents of properties available at the time of collection for a one-bedroom flat.
Can I, yeah, you just mentioned there about the UK assumptions, and I was looking through the Isle of Man Living Wage report, and it highlights very clearly the methodology where it says every adult below pension age works 37.5 hours a week. Families without children live in privately rented one-bedroom flats. Households with one child live in a 2-bed home in social rented sector, and households with 2, 3 or 4 children live in a 3-bed home in a social rented property. Can I ask you, do you validate these assumptions from an Isle of Man point of view?
No, we don't, because it's less an assumption and more a case of what has been reported in the UK as desirable for that family type. So it's not so much an assumption that families will be living in these households, as much as the UK's methodology, which we follow, has determined that people in those groups of families have declared that this is the minimum that they actually need.
Okay, can I just expand on that, because you talk about, when you look at those methodology, we assume that all of those, apart from a single person household, have homes in social housing. Do you think that's correct, or is that the correct way to look at it from a methodology point of view?
It's perhaps a case that the terminology there in our report needs to be adjusted, in that, as I say, it's less an assumption about what is happening and more a case of that is what has been specified in the minimum income standard. So in essence, it comes down to less a case of we're basing the living wage on what is actually happening, and more a case of this is what people, at least those surveyed in England, think should happen.
Okay, thank you. I mean, just want to expand on this a little further. I mean, given that public sector housing rents is around 40% less of the equivalent found in the private sector on rental cost, can I ask you if this distorts the living wage figure for those not in social housing?
So, essentially, whether you declare it as a distortion or not is a matter of where we're coming from on this, in so much as the living wage is to be viewed as an ideal, as it were. Whether we agree with that ideal or not is irrelevant. It is an ideal that is put forward. It should not, however, be viewed as necessarily something that says, once you have this value, everything is fine. Everyone's got what they need in order to live this basic level of decent living. So, under the philosophy of a living wage, it doesn't just include, and this is something that is often less remarked upon or less well understood, it is not so much a measure purely of what private employers must pay in order for people to have this quality of living. It is also through its statements about who lives where, who lives in public housing, who doesn't. It is also a statement of what government or local authorities would have to also do in order to bring this quality of living up. And in this case, you would say that what the living wage reflects is the amount of payment per hour that would be necessary from private employees in tandem with adequate and near universal provision of social housing for families of this type. So that's where it's coming from. So it's not so much of a distortion in that sense as setting out a yardstick against which payments and government provision is measured, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so the Loughborough model that you're plugging the Isle of Man sort of figures into effectively was done based on, I should say, a lot of consultation, a lot of surveys around what people of different demographics would expect. Mm-hmm. Do you have any reason to suspect that perhaps in the Isle of Man we have a very different sort of outlook on life, and that because as far as I'm aware, that consultation hasn't been done locally to try and flex the model for the Isle of Man's purpose. Do you think there is merit in doing that, or is that something that I appreciate would be a time-consuming exercise? I'm just trying to sort of scrape under the skin of it a little bit and see whether those assumptions of sort of what society thinks have ever been validated here.
So you are absolutely correct. That has not been done on the Isle of Man. Originally, when the living wage was first instituted on the island, there was a desire that, like in the United Kingdom and like in Jersey, that the living wage would be calculated, accredited, entirely on the island by, say, a third sector organisation, interested parties who are involved in this. This was a little bit before my time, but it seems from all the evidence I've witnessed that this simply wasn't of interest to anyone on the island. I believe, I may be mistaken, but I believe that it was also investigated whether outside agencies could provide it for a fee, but this might have been deemed too expensive because it is an awful lot of work.
So even in terms of some of the things where we have flexed the model and whether we've sort of validated that, so I think if I remember rightly, when you apply the metric around holiday and the amount we spend on a holiday, I think the assumption is based on a week off island.
Yes.
So it has certain off island travel costs. Again, is that something that perhaps could be validated through social attitude survey about whether a group of people in a set demographic would consider that the holiday would have to be off island or on island, or whether it would have to be a further afield, or whatever, would those sort of social norms on the Isle of Man, perhaps is that a tool that we could use to gradually validate some of the assumptions, especially the ones where we've had to adjust?
That is certainly something that we could look into, and we'd be happy to do so, yes.
Only that I think it's that number, I think perhaps more than others, is more significant in the general computation of it, rather than how much people spend on toothpaste or something like that. Okay. Sorry, thank you.
No, it's okay. Just one final question from me, if possible, Dr. Corliss, in this section. I was also reading the Economic Impact and Minimum and Living Wage report from September 23 when I was preparing for this. I was wondering if you could just outline some of the other challenges there are when calculating a living wage figure for the Isle of Man.
So certainly, that is in essence the nature of the challenge as things are currently done. It's the question of just how comparable things are using United Kingdom's baskets versus how difficult it would be for us to construct our own. It's no exaggeration to say that certainly we do not have the capacity to produce baskets on the island, and I'm not entirely sure how reliable or how useful such a process would be relative to the threat of there being differences. Just to explain that a little, it would be a question of, if we go out, try and find 60, 70 families to decide upon an adequate basket of goods, what they view as an adequate basket of goods for their household type, is that likely to be so much more reflective of the entire population as a whole than the UK's method? Is the Isle of Man that culturally distinct that its needs are sufficiently different to merit such an approach? So that would be the greatest challenge in going down that route, would be a question of resource and time, and also questions about how useful the final results would be. How much of a challenge this is, I can't comment now, because it would require a lot more technical review and consideration of this to determine that. But in essence, with regards to the living wage as it is currently calculated, we've pretty much discussed the sum of the difficulties or the challenges that are experienced.
Just a small supplementary on that. So you're basically saying that the basket of goods that we use from the UK, there's very little difference between, say, the Isle of Man and the UK when you're comparing the baskets of goods.
Well, we don't know that because we have no basket of goods for the Isle of Man to compare. But there is a question, the question that would need to be answered before which would have to be investigated and answered, would be, are the differences great enough? And is the accuracy by constructing Isle of Man baskets sufficient enough? They may be, they may not, to justify doing it entirely on the island.
Do you have a personal opinion? Do you think there is a big difference between the UK and the Isle of Man when it comes down to looking at this basket of goods, of how we set a living wage on the island?
A personal opinion would be based pretty much just on my own perceptions of society, which I'm conscious that I am a sample of one, which isn't a terribly good or wise basis for someone claiming to be a statistician to pronounce upon. I would say, however, one safeguard perhaps in using the UK method with respect to ensuring relevancy to the island is this extra stage they have of where they have expert opinion determining what basket has an adequate nutritional supplement and so forth, actually identifying physical, biological, etc. needs that must be represented by the basket. So we know that aspect, unless physiologies on the Isle of Man are wildly out of whack with our cousins in the UK and Ireland, that still applies.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Mrs. Maltby.
Maura, good morning, Dr. Collett. Thank you for joining us this morning. Some of my questions have been touched on already, but I wondered if you could possibly elaborate on what the categories are currently for the items that form the basket of goods.
Oh, yes,
and are they cross-referenced with the basket of goods used for the household income and expenditure survey?
So no, they're not. So there are broad categories in presence for the living wage. You start off with food, though this includes allowances such as, it's not just your weekly shop, it's also takeaways twice a month, eating out once a month, because a core precept of a living wage is that it should allow people to enjoy the same amenities and take part in the same activities that are deemed customary or widely available for everyone else. So that's the reason why that's there. There's also a category for alcohol, for clothing, for housing, household goods and services, personal goods and services, transport and leisure goods, which all come together to determine what is viewed that each household needs. We do not cross-refer to what might fall out of the Household Income and Expenditure Survey, because in essence those two, although superficially similar, those two baskets are to a certain extent fundamentally incompatible, in the sense that living wage baskets are supposed to determine what people should be able to afford, according to the views of the philosophy that endorses a living wage, whereas the Household Income and Expenditure Survey determines what people can afford. So there's a limitation on that makes it very difficult to actually render into something useful for the living wage.
Okay. The methodology that's currently used was last updated in 2021. Is there a period of time when you would expect that to be reviewed?
Yes, at present it boils down to when we have the time to do so. It is something that we would like to do mainly to ensure greater comparability with the United Kingdom, such as they consider a much wider, a wider group of household types and household ages. So you might have single parents with one children will be considered twice in the UK system, one with a child from 0 to 2 years old, another who's of the age of a toddler. We don't do that because of what is publicly available from Loughborough University. So it would be good to review the potential of assuming that we continued using UK baskets, it would be good, just for the sake of comparability and slightly more resolution and fine detail in our own, to have a similarly broad selection of household types and composition. However, having said that, we're relatively comfortable with what is currently in place, just because that change stands to only make a small difference in all likelihood, just because families with children, when you get down into individual subgroups on the Isle of Man, make a very small percentage, so you might alter the overall figure by a percentage of a percentage. So that's one thing. We do update the baskets in line with the UK each time the UK issues new baskets, and they tend to do that on a 4-yearly cycle. Then we adopt those. For instance, my team is currently collecting prices on the most recent baskets that were released, I think, last year in September.
Okay, thank you. Does the living wage currently factor in any element of income-related benefit for any of the households?
Factor in income-related benefit, as in, so does it take it into account? Yes, it does. The living wage is given taking into account payments through tax and national insurance that go out, and in relation to the main benefits we take into account are child benefit and my mind has gone blank.
EPA, maybe?
There we go. Thank you very much. Yes, we take into account EPA.
Okay. In 2021, Tim Wood approved a recommendation that the minimum wage should be increased over a period of 5 years to match the living wage. The effect of this would be that there'd be one minimum income figure. If there was only one minimum wage figure, what methodology would you suggest be used to calculate it?
I'm reticent to make any suggestion on this, just for the reason that to determine what a minimum wage should be, you have to determine what you want the purpose of the minimum wage to serve. Is the minimum wage there to confront poverty unconditionally? That is to say, this is what we believe is needed in order to lift so many people out of poverty, and that's what businesses will have to apply? Or is it closer to the slightly more traditional view of a minimum wage as being a fair or balanced, or whatever language you choose for this, payment, which, as far as businesses are able to accommodate, or as much as the economy is able to bear, provides people with as much money as they can have within those constraints. That is a political decision. It's a policy decision, and I'm always keen to reinforce that there is a division between us and policy. We shouldn't tamper with their work, and they certainly shouldn't tamper with ours. So I could possibly, if given enough time to review, but if someone said, this is what we want the minimum wage to do, this is what it should do, this is decided, there are all these different metrics, which is the most practical, which offers the greatest degree of accuracy, then that is something we could be involved in.
Could I just perhaps scrape into that just a little bit deeper, because the work by the Living Wage Foundation, Loughborough University, just in terms of what's the question that what they are trying to get at, because obviously if we're trying to use it for a different purpose, we need to understand the difference. So you said it was around an ideal for a decent standard of living. Is that perhaps the fairest characterisation of it?
That is. Ultimately, there are quite a few definitions that are quite similar. I believe, I could be wrong, I'm no sociologist, but they seem to mainly stem back to the work of Professor Peter Townsend, who did an awful lot of work on poverty, who essentially described poverty as consisting of that state where individuals, families or groups lack the resources to obtain the type of diet, participate in the activities, and have the living conditions and amenities which are customary among wider society, or at least widely encouraged and approved of. So that's where, with a slight inversion from poverty to this is how much money is needed in order to afford that, that is broadly the foundation of where the living wage comes from.
And that's obviously subtly different from asking the same sample of people whether that's what benefits should support or whether an employer should support that. This is about an individual's perspective of participation. Yes,
participation and an ability to enjoy the benefits of such a life.
Super, thank you. If everyone's content, we'll carry on. Just give you a slight break from the living wage calculation. But in 2021, Council Ministers reported that the best opportunity to accurately measure poverty on the Isle of Man using the Social Metrics Commission model, and it was agreed that through the next Household Income and Expenditure Survey in 23-24, the information would be collected to allow that methodology to be populated. Just wondering, has that information been gathered in such a way as to enable it that work to be done? So
yes, and we are starting that work with a review of how close it is possible to match the Social Metrics Commission's measure, which is probably worth saying. So I believe the Department for Work and Pensions in the UK took on the measure proposed by the Social Metrics Commission, and their recently produced below average resources measure is essentially their adaptation of the Social Metrics Commission's measure. I do know they were spending a lot of time looking at how they could improve upon the Social Metrics Commission's work to give it the status of an official statistic, because that has to serve it has to meet certain criteria before it can be considered such. So in talking about Social Metrics Commission's measure and DWP's below average resources, we're essentially talking about the same thing here. So we do have the data to produce a one-off shot for the HIS year of this metric. It looks currently impossible to implement the measure in its absolute fullest, because a key feature of that measure is that it's based on a 3-year average, which is important because experience in 2018 and 19 showed that when you're in the early stages of a recession, the median wage can drop enough to drop the poverty line, but because people are expecting a recovery, which may or may not come, living costs remain high. So the numbers are telling you people are moving out of poverty, but actually that isn't the case. It is certainly not feasible to run an HIS every year in its current incarnation. So we would have to look at what, if any, alternatives there are that could produce a similar a measure with all of the features that the Social Metrics Commission's measure asks for. Another limitation that needs to be aware of is, I believe, Department for Work and Pensions weight all their data that they use to come up with this measure according to a separate survey conducted by I think HMRC on the incomes and resources in the population in general. So you will have this vast wealth of data from the Family Resources Survey conducted by the ONS according to different households, and then you will weight those households to make sure that there's a proper coherence between what you're looking at and the distribution of household incomes in society at large. We have no analogue of that HMRC survey, so we can't quite do that, which might affect the accuracy of the figure, possibly not by much. And although it doesn't prevent us from producing a figure, all should be forewarned, and this will certainly be a feature of the report we do when we do produce the measure, is that response rates on the Isle of Man are low. Yeah. Sadly, this can be to a point where we have to consider the potential of non-random bias in the results. If you've seen our HIS report and read through it, you will see that we report a low response rate for that. We also report that with all available data, we've tried to identify whether there is any bias, and we haven't been able to find it. So we can, at best in that situation, say we've found no immediate reason to suppose this is biased, but it may be there. If response rates can't be improved, then there will be two issues that will have to be considered when taking any such measure into consideration for your own work. And that's, might it be biased? And 2, we're dealing with a relatively low proportion of the population, so our precision is going to be less. There's going to be more uncertainty about what the true figure is. Now, where this becomes particularly important is in the comparison in results across years. Say we were producing this figure every year, and say we had a margin of error on these estimates of in the region of 1 or 2%, which is likely. It is entirely possible with the margin of error that large that you would end up in a situation where poverty is rising and falling by a relatively noteworthy or notable level, say 50, 100 families moving into poverty each year. And because of the uncertainty around your measures, you cannot determine if what you're seeing in the figures actually reflects what's happening. So you might detect a rise, you might detect a fall, and it might be accurate, but you have no evidence that it's accurate. So this is a serious shortcoming in that respect.
But just for those who perhaps haven't seen your report, I think you were talking about a response rate going down from about 40% to 4% in the last 30 years.
Yes.
And also the way that you've then tried to expand your sample size. I mean, it felt like by the end of it, you must have asked everyone in the Isle of Man to complete the survey. I mean, by the further thousands after thousands of people that had been...
Essentially, yes. We're into the territory of where most people had a 1 in 2 chance of being surveyed.
And in terms of... That then leads you to, as you said, about that confidence interval. At what point does that confidence interval become statistically meaningless from a professional perspective? I know you've talked about, I think that you've tried to sort of come up with things around a 95% confidence interval, and that's obviously a standard or a benchmark that you work to.
The standard benchmark that's used in most applications of a 95% confidence.
So at what point do you really just give up and throw your hands in the air and say, oh, this isn't data worth knowing?
That is so. There are certain procedures you might look at for if you're dealing with analysis of small subpopulations, and this is something we're doing in future reports. You look at your relative standard error on those estimates, which, all technicalities aside, is just a figure which represents a property of those results which over a certain threshold you just put a double asterisk on and say this is no good. With respect to a more general case of when you have very low response rates, we will look at what data we have from other reliable sources, say earnings surveys, censuses, and try to identify whether there are major instances of bias seen within the sample we have. If there were, then we would discard that and say we can't rectify this. And it would be irresponsible to publish that figure. Where we can't find definite evidence of bias across a sufficiently broad range of social or economic demographics and indicators, we will do as we did in the HIS survey of say, here are our results. We are in effect presenting these as it would be the case if what we have in the sample is indeed representative. These are what the estimates would be, these are what the margins of error would be, but be aware we have a very low response rate and we can't, although we can do our best to provide some kind of reassurance that demographically and economically the sample looks good and looks reliable enough, we cannot guarantee that.
So without, I mean, appreciating you sort of trying to validate it in other ways, but are you basically telling me that below a 95% confidence interval, it's a bit of more like statistical graffiti than it is about
No,
having something meaningful?
No, I think I'm not quite sure of the usage of 95% confidence interval
I
here.
suppose I'm trying to work out what sort of... I appreciate the confidence interval is based on a purely statistical method,
Yes.
rather than before you start to add in the other validations. But I'm just trying to work out... you are always being very clear in your reports about when and when it isn't something that you would be sort of happy enough to rely on,
Yes.
I suppose.
Oh, right, I see. So yes, that the issue of reliability is one separate from a confidence interval so much. It's a confidence interval is merely
Part of that.
Yeah, it's essentially just a technical statement of what, assuming that the sample is good, what the margins of error on this will be. Everything else comes down to caveats of, review these results in light of the warning that we've identified this shortcoming or that shortcoming. But we would only in those cases... We would not publish in those cases where there was good evidence that the results should be doubted, without wishing to exclude the potential that...
So I should also mention there with the Social Metrics Commission, part of that was around the depth and persistence of poverty. So are you happy that you've managed to be able to acquire enough information to have some degree of confidence about that? Reliability, perhaps better word than confidence.
So on the depth of poverty, are we talking... sorry, this is just a clarification on the interpretation of depth.
No,
here.
I mean, I'm taking it from the Social Metrics Commission's own definitions. There were some things there that weren't previously captured by the Household Income and Expenditure Survey, and that needed specific work to go in. So that was one of them. Extra costs of disability being another that I don't think we'd actually captured before, but these are now being captured, and there is enough in there.
There should be enough in there to do that, to take into account the social metrics. I believe the phraseology they use is inescapable costs. Yes. So schooling, illness, yes, we can...
And around debt as well.
And around debt as well, yes.
I think that's, again, been another black hole of knowledge.
Yeah. And we also have we also added a question on the availability of liquid assets as well to account for that.
And I suppose that all comes back to the point that you made in the report about these surveys in the last sort of 40 years have become far more intrusive, far more expansive, because people like us want to know more about what's going on in Manx society, but that makes it harder to actually get the data.
There is an element of that. There's also just more generally and internationally a ongoing decline in response rates to surveys. All over those recent discussion about the Office for National Statistics Labour, I think it's their labour force survey, because it's been noticed that their response rates have fallen from, I think, somewhere in the region of 40-50% down to 13% in the most recent year. So this is something that is affecting all of us. The HIES, in a way, suffers more because it is such a large, intrusive survey, not just solely for the reasons of monitoring poverty, but just the depth we go into on what people have to record. So rather than being able to record just broad categories of food, we need item descriptions and so forth, which I believe is partly as a result of it being used in the FIRSA calculation. Certainly surveys before that on the HIS were a bit more simple.
So how often do you actually plan on doing the household income and expenditure surveys?
So we're tied in at least with the agreement with the UK to do them once every 5 years. to do something equivalent to the HIS much more frequently than that, we probably couldn't do that.
Talked about the difficulties, haven't we?
Yeah, we might be able to do pending resources. One thing that is worth looking at is perhaps a supplementary survey that is in essence a much more stripped down version that asks broad income categories and asks only for expenditure in those areas that are needed to produce a measure like this. That is a possibility. That's something worth reviewing that could potentially be done more frequently.
And what about the availability of other proxy data that we might sort of try and sort of acquire in terms of data from supermarkets or banks or credit card companies to sort of try and get an overview, perhaps from the, not the consumer's perspective, but the provider's perspective? Is that something that's been considered?
Not in great detail on our level, because that would require a lot of work to see what is available, what is willing to be provided, how to integrate that, if it can be integrated into our current work. My one a concern with that would be how complete is the coverage that we get from that, in terms of, because in order to produce something with decently rigorous, we'd need to know how completely that covers the entire population.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that my bank knows what I earn, and it's now going down the fact of being able to give me a report on whether I'm spending it on food, on household items, on things like that. And if I, with consent, were to give the name of my bank and my Tesco club card number, you'd probably be able to find out about half of what you needed in the household expenditure survey.
And that is a possibility that we could look at, just to demonstrate the feasibility. I'd have to look at what similar has been done elsewhere.
Just think with the decreasing reliability of the... Okay. I'll hand over to Ms Farragher.
Moramai, Dr. Corlett. So you've already touched on the answers to a couple of my questions, or touched on the questions in your responses today, but just for clarity, could you give us a brief overview of what the minimum income standard is and how it interacts with or compares to living wage calculations?
So if you could just clarify me, what do you mean by what the minimum income standard is?
What's your understanding of the minimum income standard as we use it?
So as we use it, the minimum income standards are those baskets of goods and services produced by Loughborough University, as edited by ourselves, to try and bring them more into line with what is available on the Isle of Man, with prices collected and totalled up for each family. So that is the minimum income standard. They play into the living wage. Well, they are the foundation of the living wage. You have this list of goods and services, you have their prices, you adjusted by their lifespans, etc. And then you have a total for a family of a single male, a single female, a couple. You have a total of what they need in order to enjoy that full range of goods and services, which then is we take into account and calculate what salary would be needed by that household once taxes have been taken out and once any applicable benefits that we consider are added in. What wage would be necessary to afford that basket, and then once those are calculated for each type of household, those are combined in proportion with the percentages of the island each household type makes up, to provide a weighted average figure, which is our overall statement of the living wage.
Okay, thank you. Can I just clarify then? My understanding is that there are several minimum income standards for different demographics, and then an overall figure is reached out for the living wage calculation, and that would necessarily mean that some of those demographics, the living wage is higher than what they would need,
absolutely.
and for some it's quite substantially lower than what they would
need. Yes, absolutely. And I believe you can see this on our living wage report, because we do state the living wages for each demographic and of the overall figure, so they can be compared quite readily. If memory serves, you will typically see single person households tend to be around about the living wage, maybe a little bit, maybe their living wages are slightly less. This is what you would expect, because single-person households do make up quite a large proportion of the population. You will find couples, once you add in the salaries of both, if they're both being paid a living wage, the average couple will receive quite a lot more. Whereas families, be they couples or single parents, will receive quite a bit less via a living wage than the living wage for them.
Thank you. You reported on the Gini coefficient measure in the recent household income and expenditure report. Do the results give you any understanding of why income inequality is lower here on the island than in the UK?
No, they don't at the moment. That's something that requires a fair bit more study and a fair bit of analysis. One reason may be that the question isn't so much why are we so much lower than the United Kingdom, as it is a case of why is the United Kingdom relatively so much higher than a lot of Europe, as it were. So it's not, which I'm not stating is necessarily the case, but that would need to be determined that perhaps we're not so much the outlier in this case as is the United Kingdom. At this point, any supposition as to why our Gini coefficient is lower would just be that supposition, because we haven't done the work to understand that fully yet.
Okay, that's really interesting. Do you think you will be doing that work?
It depends on the availability of time. We are a very small team, and we have to engage upon, we have to prioritise what we are already committed to doing. Having said that, there is nothing to stop others doing research into potential reasons why the Gini coefficient may be lower than the United Kingdom. It should be possible to do, with what data is out there, a reasonably good comparison of the two societies to figure that out.
Okay, thank you. And in the household income and expenditure report, you also reported on the 60% of medium income relative poverty measure.
Yes.
Could this figure be reported annually as part of the earnings survey, do you think?
No, unfortunately not. The issue we have is that when reporting poverty, you need to consider the household. And in order to consider the household, you need to consider the size of the household, and depending on what way you're using to equivalize different types of household, you might also need to know the composition of those. That's really the only sensible way to come up with a measure of poverty. Otherwise, you end up comparing incomes of households of one, of households of six, and it makes no sense whatsoever. What you could do with things like the earnings survey, or indeed administrative data that we do have access to of individual earnings, you could look at how many individuals have less than 60% of the median individual income. However, the question then has to be raised of how useful is that? because someone might be lower because they're in partnership with someone who's fantastically wealthy, or it might be with someone who has considerable assets at their disposal. So running poverty figures on individual income, you might be able to glean some kind of information from that that's of interest, but it's far, far less useful to describing poverty as we understand it, as everyone intuitively understands it, than household figures. And unfortunately, the only data we have on household figures, which also gives us other important information like size of household, number of children and ages, is the Household Income and Expenditure Survey.
Okay, thank you. I noticed that in the UK, the Department for Work and Pensions are looking at introducing a below average resources measure. What do you know about that, and do you think that it could work here on the island?
Well, we did touch upon that earlier. The below average income measure is essentially the DWP's adaptation of the Social Metric Commission's measure of poverty. And as I said before, yes, we can certainly provide a figure that adheres to most of the criterion that is, or most of the specifications of that measure, but we do have certain unavoidable shortcomings at present in the form of frequency of surveys and the depth of the analysis that's offered by what we do have available.
Okay, thank you. And so of those alternative measures that we've discussed, what do you think would most accurately reflect the cost of living and working on the Isle of Man?
So 60% below median, below average resources, social metrics, those are not directly measures of the cost of living. So they give no insight really into. You could argue that perhaps you might be able to tease out some fuzzy statement about the cost of living on the assumption that earnings are in part dictated by that, but directly they give no information whatsoever. The closest that is available on the cost of living is perhaps the living wage, because that does directly look at these at the costs of items, but again that has to be viewed through the lens of this is not just a simple investigation of cost of living. It is a look at the cost of things according to this idea of a basic decent standard of living that has been adopted across. So that if you're looking at cost of living, the minimum income standards that are worked up as part of the living wage and the living wage itself, that's the closest that we have to a cost of living comparison.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just jump in on that? You just talked about there about the median wage and everything else, and you were saying there that the cost of living is probably a more accurate figure and calculation to use when looking at living wage, etc. A lot of other jurisdictions are setting the living wage or the single rate at the median wage at around 60 or 66%. Are you saying that we shouldn't go down that, or
No.
are you saying that we just want to be clear? You're saying that we would prefer to follow the cost of the cost of living sort of calculation than the median wage?
I'm making absolutely no statement on what the minimum wage should be. I think there's a little bit confusion here, which is originates in the United Kingdom's unfortunate terminology for its own minimum wage. So,
sorry, I was talking about the median. Sorry. Apologies.
Yes. Oh no, I know. But so the United Kingdom, what we're talking about when we set things, when the United Kingdom, other jurisdictions, and set things at 60% of median wage. although I believe the United Kingdom aims to go up to 66%. The United Kingdom terms this a national living wage. That's just their name for it. And it is, in essence, it is just the minimum wage for over 21s. What we talk about when we talk in the Isle of Man about a living wage is what in the UK is called the real living wage. That's their terminology, the people who come up with it. And that is a completely different thing. That is a idealized wage based on these assumptions about what's needed to live a decent lifestyle or a good lifestyle, that does look, at least in some sense, at the cost of living. That forms a large bulwark to a large foundation to that. So those are two completely different things, the national living wage and the real living wage that are used in the United Kingdom. The choice of terminology is infinitely unfortunate, but that's the way it is. So when I talk about, if you're looking at cost of living on the Isle of Man, the living wage is the closest we have to an insight into that, with the caveat that it is constructed with this a particular aim in mind. I'm not saying that that's what the minimum wage should or shouldn't be.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I just go back to the follow-up on the questions by Ms Farragher about the Gini coefficient? I mean, for my sins, I stopped studying economics at A-level, so and we'd never covered this.
Yeah.
So can you just perhaps talk about what ingredients go into that calculation and what it's trying to tell us? I appreciate it's about sort of income inequality, but can you tell us about, just in broad terms, how it's calculated?
No, absolutely. So in broad terms, what you do for the Gini, it can vary. What we have attempted to do here is you have your household incomes available, you take away what they're paying in tax, and the housing costs, etc., and then you will equivalize those by some way of making them comparable. So this, by equivalizing, I just mean you try and make it so that households of different sizes, different compositions can be compared in a sensible way. So most schemes take a household with 2 adults, no children, as kind of the base measurement. So you will multiply all of those households' figures by 1. Then you will look at households with just 1 person in, and they are modified by a constant, just so you don't end up with this situation which I described previously, where you're trying to compare 2 households on the same income. One just consists of 1 person, one consists of 2 people with 3 children. So the incomes are equivalized according to household size and composition, and that renders them amenable to creating the Gini coefficient, which in less fancy terms is essentially just a curve called a Lorentz curve, and the area under that can be used to determine the level of inequality and equality. Essentially what it attempts to measure is the degree to which incomes are concentrated or not in just a few hands. The Gini coefficient goes from 0 to 1, with one end of the spectrum being total equality. Everyone has the same amount of income, to 1, which is where just 1 person or 1 household has all of the income and everyone else has nothing. So you will see Gini coefficients reported for different countries, and this will be a way of comparing them on that scale. As they go higher, there's more inequality, more wealth is concentrated in fewer hands.
So in the Isle of Man context, where we have a small number of exceedingly rich people, which perhaps might be disproportionate to larger populations, we'd expect to see perhaps a higher coefficient than a lot of other European countries, perhaps.
We might do, yes, certainly. It depends on the level of inequality in those countries. Inequality is known to be quite strong, for instance, in the United Kingdom. It also depends on what we are looking at, as in whether they take into account, whether they just focus on income, and ours is unfortunately limited to a lot of income, or do they take into account assets, wealth, assets both physical and liquid, etc.
Okay. So can you give any indication as to how this is used in terms of policy making or anything like that?
Not off the top of my head, because as I say, I try and keep myself as distant as possible from policy making. But one of the main uses, and not just for policy, is as a measure, and to be sure, an imperfect measure, as all measures are, of over time how inequality is changing. So if you happen to notice that your Gini coefficient is rising, you may want to investigate further into that. Is this because inequality is generally rising, would be the first question. The second question might be, is this having an effect on poverty levels? Is this something that we should be concerned about, etc., etc.? So it's really the starting point for those conversations.
And as you said, ours is sort of far more in line with places like Canada, Sweden, France, as opposed to the UK, which is more of an outlier in this. But given that, should we read in anything into it that actually our relative poverty is lower here in the Isle of Man than it is in the UK? Are those two quite congruent?
They may well be, and that's certainly a good example of two facts when taken together suggest that further investigation would be profitable.
Okay. We've also been looking at wages, inflation, and that sort of thing, because obviously 6% of median wage is another important metric to look at. So therefore, what goes into that and how that's done. And we touched a little bit earlier about what that means in real terms. And we did, I don't pretend again to be a statistician, but I love a good spreadsheet. From my basic calculations, it appeared that inflation adjusted, taking 2008 as a starting point, the median wage fell between about 2009 and 2013 after inflation was adjusted for, and then it's slowly risen, and it's now back to about where it was in 2008 on a sort of index. In broad terms, without having gone over my spreadsheet, and I appreciate I haven't shared it with you, does that sort of sound about right in terms of that assessment? And what do you think that the impact of that will have been on poverty over that time, if that is true? Let's put that in those terms without asking you to verify some figures that you've never seen.
Absolutely. So obviously I haven't seen this and I haven't looked quite into that. One thing I would add in that might need to be taken into account is also the margin of error on these figures. I know we are expanding our reportage of margins of error and other statistical information like that across our reports. And I know at least on the average wage, full-time earnings wage, we did notice that the margins of error were such that at least for 3-4 years or so, past years, it could be that there's been no change in real terms once inflation is taken into account. So and it's an interesting question. I would actually like to see your figures.
I will be happy to share them with you.
I will look forward to that. the reason I mentioned that is it'd be interesting to see that trend that you describe, if true, how that changes if we do factor in margins of error that are present in the earnings survey. How it might have affected poverty is a question that I would be happy to come back to you fuller in writing if desired. But I imagine if you're looking at the median wage falling, then you could expect to see, according to these 60% of median measures of poverty, at least in the short term, you might notice poverty seems to drop as the median is brought down, because essentially you're lowering the threshold over which people are no longer classed as being in poverty. Whether this reflects an actual decrease in poverty in the sense of having insufficient means is of course a different matter, because then you have to consider, has the cost of living dropped or equivalently, but much harder to measure. Have cultural norms changed over those periods where people expect less, as it were, which can also factor into whether we consider poverty is present or not.
I suppose it's sort of led to the question of then, when you're producing your median earnings work that you do, whether there's merit in looking at or including in that a more longitudinal version of inflation-adjusted median wages to see what is happening over time, because that was definitely a trend that was sort of spottable when I started tracking that back and looking at that historic data and what that might mean, and what that, say again in terms of trends, how that might reflect a change in society and societal.
No, that is certainly the case, and we have been moving in that direction. There's always been there's always been some element of longitudinal reporting in the earnings survey. They're not going back as far. The only hurdle we need to overcome to offer that, and I do agree it would be useful and important, there was a slight change of methodology. I can't quite remember which year it was in. I'm leaning towards 2015, but I might be incorrect. That we will have to review and see if there's a way of adjusting the data in such a way that we can stitch those two time series, everything before and everything after, together in a sensible way.
Again, I somewhat arbitrarily just picked, April CPI, but I suppose as long as you're using something similar every time. Okay. Also, you noted in your recent report that poverty rates jumped to about 25% of people in private sector rental. That does seem to reflect quite a significant problem with rent prices in that area, really sort of changing the cost of living quite considerably here compared to the UK. Is that a fair comment?
Let me see, because I can't off the top of my head recall what the United Kingdom's figure for relative poverty after housing costs among people in the private sector.
Okay.
I'd have to have a look at that.
I suppose it was a big change compared to those in the Isle of Man. So I think it was 17% compared to 25% in private rental compared to public rental, and that seemed a big gap. Right.
So the relative the estimates for population living in relative poverty for the Isle of Man was 11%, and it rises to 15% once housing costs are factored in.
Yeah.
But you then commented that for the private rental population, this was 25%, if that helps. And then in the UK, they had 17% in relative poverty, and that rose to 21% for when housing costs were factored in, but there wasn't a UK private rental figure.
Exactly. So that's unfortunately that's something we weren't able to find in time to meet our deadline to publish this, but it is something that we can look at in order to provide a better comparison of.
I suppose just in terms of cost of living on the Isle of Man, it indicates at least that private rental costs are significant, or enough of a concern to actually quite considerably change some of these dynamics, really.
Certainly that's one interpretation. Perhaps another interpretation is that those who are in private renting are, and I have no idea whether it's true or not, but a similar situation could result if private rental is typically, in the main, taken up by people who are already close to that level of being in relative poverty. Yeah. Possibly because if there's unavailability of credit, mortgages, etc., or the inability to come up with the deposit necessary, that those people might be put into the private, they might find themselves in the private rental market. And of course, because they're already perhaps just above or a little bit above, that then results in a higher proportion of those in the private rental market showing up in relative poverty.
Yeah, and just compared to the last census, that was about 18% of households, so it's potentially quite a big number of people that are going to be affected here. So in terms of policy solutions, it seems like an obvious area to hone in on. Okay, I think that was everything I had to ask. I'll go around the table and see if anyone has any final questions. Ms. Farragher, I'll start with you.
No, I'm fine, thank you.
Okay, Mrs. Maltby.
Yeah, same, thank you very much.
Joe? No?
No, I'm okay, thank you.
Okay, well, in which case then that concludes the session before us today. Thank you very much, Dr. Cullet, for coming in. It's much appreciated. We appreciate your evidence, and with that, the committee will sit in private. Thank you.
Thank you very much.